Chapter 1. Introduction. There are places on this earth that exist in the space between what we know and what we wonder, places that appear on maps with careful omissions, their boundaries marked by chain link and warning signs, their secrets buried beneath layers of clearance and classification. Some of these places become legends before they ever become facts, whispered about in diners along desert highways, argued over in late-night radio shows, their very existence denied even as their silhouettes loom against the Nevada sky. Area 51 is such a place, and tonight, as you settle into the quiet hours, we follow the stories that have gathered around it like moths to a distant light. The desert north of Las Vegas stretches in all directions, a vast emptiness of salt flats and scrubland, where the air shimmers in daylight and grows cold when the sun abandons the horizon. It is a landscape that seems designed for secrecy, where distances deceive the eye and the nearest town feels a world away. Within this expanse lies Groom Lake, a dry lake bed so flat and featureless it might as well be another planet, and along its northern edge sits a facility that has accumulated more speculation than almost any other site on Earth. For decades, the government refused to acknowledge its existence at all, even as satellite photographs revealed runways longer than most commercial airports, hangars large enough to swallow entire passenger jets, and a constellation of buildings whose purposes remained deliberately vague. Those who work there, or claim to have worked there, sign documents thick with legal consequences. They arrive on unmarked planes that depart from a terminal in Las Vegas, with no listed flights, no public schedules, no connection to the everyday world of travel and tourism. They pass through security that strips away not just personal belongings, but any sense of ordinary accountability, entering a realm where questions go unanswered and curiosity itself becomes a liability. And when they return to the world beyond the perimeter, they carry with them a silence that feels heavier than mere discretion, as though they have witnessed something that language cannot quite accommodate. The stories that have emerged from that silence are extraordinary. Some speak of aircraft that move in ways no conventional engineering can explain, hovering without visible means of propulsion, accelerating to speeds that should shatter any known material, turning at angles that would obliterate a human pilot. Others describe underground facilities reaching deep into the Nevada bedrock, laboratories where the line between human technology and something else entirely grows blurred and uncertain. There are accounts of recovered materials, objects pulled from crash sites, and transported under cover of night, analysed by scientists who signed away their right to ever speak of what they discovered. And threading through all of it, persistent as the desert wind, are the whispers of contact, of beings not born on this world, of knowledge too dangerous or too destabilizing to be acknowledged in the light of day. These are not new stories. They reach back decades, accumulating like sediment, layer upon layer of testimony and rumour, official denial and leaked documentation. Some of those who have spoken paid heavy prices for their words, losing careers and credibility, finding themselves suddenly and thoroughly discredited by forces they could not name or fight. Others have remained anonymous, their accounts filtering through journalists and researchers, second-hand voices describing first-hand impossibilities. The result is a tapestry of the unconfirmed, a mythology built from fragments of truth and supposition, where the most fantastic claims sit uncomfortably close to verifiable facts. What makes Area 51 so enduring as a source of mystery is not simply what is claimed to happen there, but the way those claims echo the deeper questions we carry about our place in the universe. Are we alone, or are we being watched? Has contact already occurred, known only to a select few who have decided on our behalf that we are not ready for the answer? And if such knowledge exists, hidden in hangars and underground vaults, what does that say about the relationship between citizens and the institutions meant to serve them? These questions do not resolve easily into skepticism or belief. They linger in the uncertain territory between the two, and it is in that territory that we will spend the hours ahead. As you listen, you may find yourself drifting between scenes and testimonies, between the documented and the speculated, moving through a landscape where the boundaries are deliberately unclear. This is not a story that offers neat conclusions or definitive answers. It is instead an invitation to explore what happens when secrecy becomes so absolute that the space it creates fills with wonder and suspicion in equal measure. The voices you will hear belong to engineers and whistleblowers, pilots and physicists, people who saw something they could not explain or learned something they were never meant to share. Some of their accounts have been corroborated by declassified documents. Others remain exactly what they were when first spoken, unverified and unverifiable, held together only by the conviction of those who tell them. The desert does not judge these stories. It simply holds them, the way it holds the secrets of the base itself, patient and indifferent beneath the turning stars. And as the night deepens and your breathing slows, we begin our journey into that holding, into the strange and contested history of a place that may contain the most profound revelation of our time, or may contain nothing more than the ordinary work of defense and aerospace, magnified by distance and desire into something it never was. Either way, the stories remain, and they are worth hearing. Chapter 2: The Desert That Holds Secrets. The basin and range country of southern Nevada exists in a state of perpetual exposure. Mountain ridges rise abruptly from valley floors, their slopes bare of trees, their geology written plainly across rock faces that have weathered under a relentless sun for millions of years. Water is scarce here, appearing only in sudden storms that carve temporary rivers through arroyos, before vanishing into sand and stone. The vegetation clings low to the earth, sagebrush and creosote adapted to survival, in a place that offers little mercy and less concealment. It is, in almost every way, a landscape that refuses to hide anything, and perhaps that is precisely why it was chosen as the site for the most secretive installation in the American military infrastructure. Groom Lake sits within this austere geography like a scar on the Earth's surface, a dried remnant of the Pleistocene era, when these valleys held water deep enough to drown mountains. The lakebed itself stretches for miles, perfectly flat, its surface a pale crust of alkaline minerals that cracks under the summer heat and turns treacherous with mud during the rare winter rains. From certain vantage points along the surrounding peaks, the base appears as a cluster of geometric shapes against that flatness, hangars and towers and the dark lines of runways extending across the playa like scars on pale skin. But those vantage points are fewer now than they once were. The boundaries of restricted airspace expanded over decades. The land itself acquired through quiet federal transactions that pushed the perimeter farther and farther from prying eyes. The nearest town is Rachel, a collection of mobile homes and a single restaurant called the Little Ailey Inn, its name a playful acknowledgment of the legends that have made this stretch of State Route 375 famous. The state officially designated this road the Extraterrestrial Highway in 1996, a nod to the tourism that has become Rachel's primary economy, but long before any official recognition, locals knew this area as a place where strange things appeared in the night sky. Lights that moved with purpose and impossible speed, objects that hovered soundlessly above the mountains before vanishing. Phenomena that could be dismissed as atmospheric tricks or military exercises, except that they persisted, reported by ranchers and miners and highway patrol officers whose credibility could not easily be questioned. To approach Area 51 legally is to confront a series of increasingly stern warnings. The road toward Groom Lake from the town of Rachel deteriorates from paved highway to gravel track, winding through hills covered in Joshua trees and weathered rock. Eventually even that rough road ends at a point marked by orange posts and signs bearing simple, unambiguous language. Photography is prohibited. Trespassing will result in arrest and prosecution. The use of deadly force is authorized. Beyond these warnings, the land appears empty, just more desert stretching toward a distant mountains. But those who have lingered at this boundary report a persistent sense of being observed, a feeling that intensifies until it becomes almost physical, as though invisible eyes are measuring every movement, every intention. The sensors are real, of course. They bristle along the ridgelines, small installations camouflaged to blend with the terrain, motion detectors and cameras and equipment whose exact capabilities remain classified. White pickup trucks patrol the perimeter roads, driven by security contractors who watch the watchers, men in civilian clothes and sunglasses who park on hillsides with binoculars and radio equipment, maintaining a boundary that exists as much through intimidation as through physical barriers. They are called camo dudes by the UFO enthusiasts and curious travellers who make pilgrimages to these remote coordinates, and they perform their duties with a studied indifference that somehow makes their presence more unsettling than any overt aggression might. From the high ground of Tickaboo Peak, one of the last remaining legal vantage points that offers a distant view of the base, Groom Lake appears reduced by distance to something almost abstract. The hangars lose their scale, becoming simple rectangles of lighter colour against the desert floor. The runways stretch like thin pencil lines across the playa, and on certain days, if the air is clear enough and the timing fortunate, small shapes can be seen moving near those structures, aircraft or vehicles too far away to identify with certainty. It requires a significant hike to reach this viewpoint, several hours of climbing through terrain that offers no shade and little comfort, and even then, what can be observed amounts to shapes and suggestions, nothing definitive, nothing that satisfies the questions that bring people to these remote slopes. Yet the desert itself seems to collaborate with secrecy. The heat creates mirages that bend light and distort perception, making distances impossible to judge accurately, turning solid objects into wavering uncertainties. At night, the darkness is so complete that a handheld flashlight becomes visible for miles, and the stars overhead multiply into vast fields of light that can overwhelm any sense of scale or orientation. Sound travels strangely through these dry valleys, sometimes carrying for incredible distances, sometimes vanishing entirely, absorbed by the topology and the dense, still air. A jet engine's roar might reach someone standing 10 miles away while remaining inaudible to someone half that distance, depending on wind and temperature and the particular geometry of the landscape at that moment. This is a place where nature and human intention have formed an unlikely partnership. The remoteness that makes life difficult makes secrecy easier, and the harshness of the environment serves as its own form of security, discouraging casual visitors and testing the determination of those who come seeking answers. The military did not need to build high walls or extensive fencing when the desert itself provides such effective isolation. And perhaps there is something fitting in that, the idea that the most significant secrets of the modern age are kept not in fortified bunkers beneath urban centres, but in a place where the earth itself seems ancient and indifferent, where human concerns fade against the scale of geological time, and the empty sky holds mysteries that predate any government or nation. The sun sets quickly here, the shadows lengthening and then surrendering entirely to darkness within the span of minutes. When night arrives, the temperature drops precipitously, and the desert takes on a quality that feels both exposed and enclosing, as though the absence of light creates its own form of containment. Those who maintain their vigils at the boundary often report that this is when the desert truly reveals itself, not through what can be seen, but through what can be felt. A presence that might be nothing more than the weight of expectation, or might be something else entirely, something that watches back from the darkness beyond the orange posts and warning signs. Chapter 3: Bob Lazar and S4 Story. In November of 1989, a man appeared on Las Vegas television using the pseudonym Dennis, his face obscured in shadow, his voice altered by electronic processing. He claimed to have worked at a facility south of Groom Lake, a location he referred to as S4, where he had been employed as a physicist tasked with reverse engineering propulsion systems from craft of non-human origin. The interview was brief, cautious, hedged, with the kind of vagueness that accompanies fear of legal repercussion, but the claims themselves were specific enough to be either entirely fabricated or devastatingly true. Within weeks, the man would reveal his identity as Bob Lazar, and his testimony would become the single most influential account in the modern mythology of Area 51, a story that has been investigated, attacked, defended, and dissected for more than 3 decades without reaching any final resolution. Lazar described S4 as a facility built into the mountainside at Papoose Lake, a dry lake bed adjacent to Groom Lake, its hangars disguised to blend with the natural slope of the terrain. From a distance, he said, these hangars appeared as nothing more than the continuation of the hillside itself, their doors designed to open like the mouth of a cave, revealing interiors where craft unlike anything in the public aerospace inventory sat waiting for study. He spoke of 9 such craft in total, though he claimed to have worked directly with only one, a disc-shaped object roughly 30 to 40 feet in diameter, its hull smooth and seamless, lacking any visible welds or rivets, as though it had been formed from a single piece of material rather than assembled from components. The propulsion system, according to Lazar, operated on principles that violated conventional physics, as it is taught in universities and applied in laboratories. He described a reactor that used a stable isotope of element 115, a substance not found naturally on Earth, to generate a gravitational field that could be amplified and focused, effectively creating localized distortions in space-time itself. This was not thrust in the traditional sense, not the reaction of expelled mass creating forward momentum, but rather a manipulation of gravity that allowed the craft to move by warping the fabric of space around it. It was a concept more at home in theoretical papers than in practical engineering, and yet Lazar spoke of it with the specific confidence of someone describing machinery he had personally observed and attempted to understand. His background became immediate subject to scrutiny. Lazar claimed degrees in physics and electronic technology from institutions including the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the California Institute of Technology, but when journalists and researchers attempted to verify these credentials, they found no records of his attendance, no documentation in alumni directories, no evidence that he had ever been enrolled. Critics seized on this absence as proof of fabrication, suggesting that Lazar had invented not only his academic history, but his entire account of working at S4. Supporters countered that such erasure was precisely what would be expected if a classified program sought to discredit a whistleblower, removing evidence of employment and education to undermine credibility, while avoiding the legal complications of direct prosecution. What could not be disputed was that Lazar knew details about Groom Lake operations that should not have been accessible to someone without inside knowledge. He accurately described the layout of certain facilities, the security procedures involving hand-scanning biometric systems, and the existence of the shuttle flights that transported workers from Las Vegas to the base. He also correctly predicted specific dates when test flights would occur, leading groups of friends and curiosity seekers to desert vantage points where they witnessed lights moving in ways that seemed to confirm his claims. These observations were documented on videotape, shaky footage showing bright points of light ascending from the direction of Groom Lake, hovering, performing maneuvers that appeared inconsistent with conventional aircraft, though the distance and darkness made definitive identification impossible. Lazar's story included other elements that strained credibility, even as they added to its strange internal consistency. He spoke of briefing documents he had been allowed to read, papers describing contact with extraterrestrial beings, and a history of interactions spanning decades, though he claimed his access to this information was limited and fragmentary. He mentioned seeing a small, grey-skinned figure briefly through a window in another part of the facility, though he could not say with certainty whether what he glimpsed was biological or an elaborate training prop designed to maintain operational secrecy through misdirection. These details seemed designed to invoke skepticism, too perfectly aligned with popular imagery of alien contact, and yet they formed part of a narrative that Lazar told consistently, rarely embellishing or expanding, maintaining the same core account across hundreds of interviews over the course of decades. The scientific community largely dismissed his claims, pointing out errors in his explanations of physics and inconsistencies in his descriptions of how the alleged technology functioned. Element 115, which Lazar claimed was central to the propulsion system, was synthesized in laboratories years after his initial testimony, but it proved highly unstable, decaying in fractions of a second, nothing like the stable isotope he had described. His understanding of gravity and its relationship to other fundamental forces appeared garbled, mixing legitimate physics with concepts that did not align with established theory. To trained physicists, these discrepancies suggested someone with superficial knowledge attempting to construct a plausible-sounding explanation without the deep comprehension that actual work in the field would provide. And yet the story persisted, refusing to fade even as other UFO narratives rose and fell from public attention. Lazar himself largely withdrew from the spotlight after the initial media frenzy, returning to private life and expressing occasional frustration with the notoriety his claims had brought him. He opened a scientific supply company, selling equipment and chemicals to schools and hobbyists, avoiding the conference circuit and the repetitive cycle of belief and dismissal that surrounded discussions of Area 51. Those who met him often described someone who seemed uncomfortable with his role as a central figure in UFO lore, more interested in practical chemistry and physics than in speculation about extraterrestrial contact, as though he had reported what he witnessed and was now simply waiting for the world to catch up or move on. The question of Bob Lazar does not resolve into simple categories of truth or deception. Too many elements of his account prove difficult to verify or disprove conclusively, and the passage of time has only added layers of complexity rather than clarity. If he fabricated the story, He did so with unusual attention to consistency and detail, maintaining it through decades when financial incentive and public attention might have encouraged elaboration or alteration. If he told the truth, then the implications reach far beyond the existence of a single facility in the Nevada desert, suggesting a level of technological knowledge and governmental secrecy that would fundamentally alter our understanding of human history and our place in the broader cosmos. The mountains around Papoose Lake stand silent on the matter, their slopes showing no obvious sign of the hangar doors Lazar described. But absence of visible evidence in a landscape designed for concealment proves nothing, and the story lingers like heat shimmer above the desert floor, distorting everything seen through it, impossible to dismiss and equally impossible to confirm. Chapter 4: Alien Craft, hidden inside Area 51. The notion that technology from beyond this world rests inside climate-controlled hangars in the Nevada desert carries with it a peculiar weight, a collision between the mundane infrastructure of military secrecy and implications so vast they resist easy contemplation. If such craft exist, they would require not just storage but study, teams of engineers and physicists working in shifts to document every surface and seam, to understand materials that might not correspond to any element on the periodic table, to decipher propulsion systems that operate according to principles that current science can only approximate in abstract mathematics. The logistical reality of such an endeavour would be immense, involving supply chains and personnel rotations, security protocols and disposal of research materials, all conducted under layers of classification that would make every coffee break and bathroom visit a potential breach of national security. The descriptions that have emerged over the years share certain recurring characteristics, even when they come from sources with no apparent connection to one another. The craft are typically described as disc-shaped or triangular, their hulls smooth to the point of appearing almost organic, lacking the panel lines and axis hatches that mark conventional aircraft as assemblages of parts. Some accounts mention a peculiar quality to the surface material, neither quite metallic nor ceramic, sometimes described as having a faint iridescence or the ability to shift appearance depending on the angle of observation. These details could be the result of witnesses influencing one another through shared cultural imagery of what alien technology should look like, or they could represent genuine consistency in observed phenomena, multiple people describing the same unusual properties because those properties are actually present. One of the more intriguing aspects of these accounts involves the absence of what we would consider standard aerospace features. No visible engines or exhaust ports, no landing gear or control surfaces like the ailerons and rudders that allow conventional aircraft to maneuver through air resistance. If the craft rely on some form of gravity manipulation or space-time distortion as Lazar suggested, such features would be unnecessary, even counterproductive, but their absence creates objects that seem somehow incomplete, as though essential components have been removed or were never there to begin with. Witnesses who claim to have seen these craft up close often struggle to articulate what makes them appear so foreign, settling finally on the inadequate phrase that they simply do not look built, do not carry the visual language of human engineering with its emphasis on function following form. The question of how such craft might have come into American possession generates its own constellation of theories. The most dramatic involves crashes, retrieval operations conducted in remote locations, where something unknown came down hard enough to leave debris but intact enough to provide recoverable technology. Roswell, New Mexico in 1947 remains the most famous of these alleged incidents, its initial military press release describing the recovery of a flying disc, later retracted and explained as a weather balloon, though declassified documents from decades later revealed the balloon story itself was a cover for a classified surveillance program called Project Mogul. Whether anything beyond the wreckage of that program was recovered remains contested, but Roswell established a template, a pattern of initial acknowledgement followed by official denial that would repeat itself in other incidents, other locations, other moments when something fell from the sky and disappeared into classified channels. Some researchers have proposed that the craft were not acquired through crashes but through exchange, suggesting scenarios where contact was established and technology transferred through negotiation rather than salvage. These theories often invoke underground facilities where such meetings might have occurred, deep installations where human and non-human representatives could interact away from public awareness, working out arrangements whose details remain locked behind security classifications that may never be lifted. The evidence for such claims is thin, resting primarily on second- and third-hand testimony, anonymous sources describing programs with code names that cannot be verified, accounts that blend plausible detail with speculation so freely that separating fact from elaboration becomes impossible. Within the aerospace and defense contracting community, there are whispers of programs so classified that their very existence is compartmentalized, known only to those with specific need and clearance. These special access programs, or SAPs as they are designated, operate outside normal oversight channels, their budgets hidden within broader allocations, their personnel vetted through processes that can take years and involve background investigations extending to childhood friends and distant relatives. It is within these programs, if anywhere, that the study of recovered technology would occur, work conducted by individuals who understand that speaking about their employment, even confirming or denying basic facts about their daily activities, could result in federal prosecution and imprisonment. The hangars themselves, according to those who claim knowledge of their interiors, are designed with considerations that go beyond typical aircraft storage. Climate control systems maintain precise temperature and humidity levels to prevent degradation of materials whose properties may not be fully understood. Access requires multiple forms of authentication, biometric scanners and cipher codes, and armed guards who verify identity at each threshold. The interior lighting is described as harsh and clinical. Fluorescent banks that eliminate shadows and make every surface visible. As though the act of observation itself is the primary purpose of these spaces, the craft positioned like specimens in a laboratory, turned into subjects for endless documentation and measurement. Some accounts mention that the craft cannot be disassembled in conventional ways, that attempts to remove panels or access internal components have proven unsuccessful, the hulls remaining sealed as though they were never meant to be opened, or were designed by minds that conceived of maintenance and repair in fundamentally different terms. This inability to examine internal systems would add layers of frustration to any reverse engineering effort. Researchers forced to work from external observation and whatever subtle emanations or fields the craft might produce, trying to deduce function from form without the benefit of seeing how components interconnect or what principles govern their operation. It would be like attempting to understand modern electronics with only the ability to look at the outside of a sealed computer case, knowing something functional exists within but unable to access the actual circuits and processes that make it work. The psychological burden on those who work with such technology, if it exists, would be considerable. To possess knowledge that rewrites fundamental assumptions about humanity's place in the universe, while being legally prohibited from sharing that knowledge, to spend your working hours examining technology that implies intelligence beyond Earth, while returning each evening to a world that largely dismisses such possibilities as fantasy. Some researchers have suggested this could explain certain patterns in the UFO disclosure community, individuals who speak in careful allusions and qualified statements, hinting at knowledge they cannot fully reveal, testing the boundaries of what they are permitted to say while remaining safely within the constraints of their security oaths. The craft, if they rest in those hangars, remain silent on their origins and purpose. They do not volunteer explanations or offer instruction manuals, and whatever secrets they contain must be extracted through painstaking effort, if they can be extracted at all. The desert outside continues its patient work of erosion and endurance, indifferent to what human hands might be attempting in the controlled environments within the mountains, while above the stars turn in their ancient patterns, some of them perhaps home to those who built what now sits grounded and inert, waiting for understanding that may or may not ever arrive. Chapter 5. Witnesses Outside the Fence. The people who gather at the edges of restricted airspace come from varied circumstances and motivations, united by curiosity that has proven stronger than the considerable inconvenience of reaching these remote coordinates. Some arrive as part of organized tours, passengers in vans that make the long drive from Las Vegas with stops at the Little Ale Inn, for alien-themed merchandise and burgers served by waitstaff accustomed to questions about lights in the sky. Others come alone, driving rental cars or motorcycles down State Route 375, with hand-drawn maps and coordinates scribbled on notepads, determined to see for themselves what years of reading and speculation have built up in their imaginations. They park at the designated viewpoints, set up cameras with telephoto lenses, and wait with the patience of birdwatchers hoping for a glimpse of something rare and disputed. What they observe varies considerably depending on timing and fortune. On many nights, nothing unusual occurs, just the ambient darkness of the desert, broken occasionally by the distant lights of conventional aircraft passing overhead on commercial flight paths, their navigation strobes blinking in predictable patterns as they cross from one horizon to another. The base itself often appears dormant from these distant vantage points, showing only the minimal illumination required for security, small points of light that might mark guard posts or the entrance to facilities whose bulk remains hidden in darkness. These quiet nights disappoint some visitors, who pack their equipment after a few hours and drive back towards civilization, feeling that they have wasted fuel and time on what amounts to staring at empty sky above empty desert. But other nights reward patience with phenomena that defy easy explanation. Lights that appear suddenly above the mountain ridges, sometimes singular, sometimes in formations of 3 or 4, moving in ways that conventional aircraft cannot replicate. They hover motionless for minutes at a time, then accelerate to speeds that carry them from one end of the visible sky to the other in seconds, stopping again with no apparent deceleration, no gradual slowing, but simply the transition from motion to stillness, as though momentum itself does not apply. Some witnesses describe these lights as orange or amber, others as brilliant white with occasional shifts to red or blue, the colours seeming to pulse or breathe rather than remaining constant, as though the light source possesses some quality beyond simple illumination. A rancher named Steve Medlin lived for years on property adjacent to the restricted zone, his land grandfathered in from a time before the military expanded its buffer around Groom Lake. He reported seeing unusual activity with such frequency that it became simply part of the environment, no more remarkable than the seasonal arrival of certain bird species or the patterns of summer storms. Objects moving at treetop level across his property in the early morning hours, completely silent, leaving no exhaust trail or disturbance in their wake. Medlin described one incident where something passed directly overhead while he was working on a fence line, close enough that he instinctively ducked, though the object made no sound and seemed to generate no downdraft or turbulence, moving through the air as though the air itself offered no resistance. The community of regular observers, those who return to these viewpoints repeatedly over months and years, develop a kind of informal expertise in distinguishing between conventional military activity and events that fall outside known parameters. They learn to recognize the sound signatures of different aircraft, the F-16s and transport planes and helicopters that constitute the normal traffic of a test facility, and they note when something appears that carries no familiar acoustic profile, either moving in complete silence or producing sounds described as low-frequency hums or high-pitched whines unlike jet engines or rotor wash. These experienced watchers also become familiar with the various flare patterns and testing schedules, able to identify when distant lights correspond to known exercises rather than unexplained activity, though this expertise sometimes makes the genuinely anomalous events more striking rather than less, the contrast between the familiar and the impossible becoming sharper with knowledge. Photography from these distances presents significant challenges. Even powerful telephoto lenses struggle with the heat distortion and atmospheric conditions that plague desert optics, and objects that appear dramatic to the human eye often translate to ambiguous points of light on film or digital sensors, lacking the context and resolution needed to make definitive determinations about what is being observed. Video footage fares somewhat better, capturing movement and behavior over time, but even high-definition cameras cannot eliminate the fundamental problem of distance and darkness. What results is a vast archive of documentation that proves simultaneously compelling and frustratingly inconclusive, images and clips that show something unusual occurring while failing to provide the clarity necessary to identify exactly what that something might be. There are accounts from witnesses who are not seeking unusual phenomena, people whose proximity to the area came through circumstance rather than choice. Military personnel stationed at Nellis Air Force Base, the sprawling complex that encompasses the restricted zones around Groom Lake, occasionally report experiences that trouble their understanding of conventional operations. A security officer who claimed to have observed a disc-shaped object descend into a canyon near the perimeter, moving slowly and deliberately before disappearing from view behind a ridge. An air traffic controller who tracked something on radar that exhibited flight characteristics inconsistent with any aircraft in the military inventory. accelerating from a standstill to supersonic speeds instantaneously, then vanishing from screens as though it had simply ceased to exist in detectable space. These insider accounts carry particular weight because they come from individuals trained in aircraft identification and radar operation, people whose professional expertise makes misidentification less likely, though critics point out that unfamiliar technology being tested at the base could easily be mistaken for something otherworldly by personnel not briefed on the latest classified programs. The secrecy that surrounds advanced aerospace development creates a situation where even those working within the broader military structure may encounter technology they do not recognize, prototypes so far beyond publicly acknowledged capabilities that they appear to violate known principles of aerodynamics and propulsion. This ambiguity works to the advantage of those who wish to maintain operational security, every unexplained sighting potentially serving as cover for legitimate testing, the actual capabilities of new systems obscured within a fog of speculation about extraterrestrial craft. The emotional response of witnesses varies considerably. Some describe feelings of awe and excitement, the thrill of observing something that challenges conventional understanding, a sense that they have been granted a glimpse behind the curtain that separates ordinary reality from something far stranger. Others report unease or fear, particularly when the phenomena occur at close range, the presence of something unknown and uncontrolled triggering instinctive wariness. A few speak of lasting effects, changes in worldview or persistent questions that follow them back to their daily lives, the memory of what they witnessed refusing to settle into comfortable categories of explained or dismissed, instead occupying an unsettling middle ground where certainty becomes impossible. The fence line itself, marked by its orange posts and warning signs, becomes a kind of theatre where this drama of observation and speculation plays out night after night. On one side, the watchers with their cameras and binoculars, hoping for validation of beliefs or simply the excitement of witnessing something extraordinary. On the other side, whatever actually occurs within those restricted boundaries, whether mundane testing of advanced but entirely terrestrial technology, or something that would rewrite textbooks and upend the comfortable assumptions by which most people navigate their understanding of the possible. The distance between these two sides measures more than miles across desert terrain. It measures the gap between what is known and what is claimed, between official statements and witnessed experience, and that gap shows no signs of closing, maintained as carefully as the security perimeter itself. Chapter 6. Theories of Alien Technology Storage. The practical questions surrounding the storage of non-human technology occupy a space between engineering problem-solving and philosophical speculation. If objects of unknown origin and uncertain properties exist within military custody, how would they be housed, handled, and preserved across decades? The answer requires considering not just physical containment, but the institutional frameworks necessary to maintain secrecy while allowing controlled access for study, a balance between protection and investigation that would demand unprecedented levels of coordination across multiple agencies and classification tiers. Each theory about how this might be accomplished reveals assumptions about both the nature of the technology itself and the capabilities of those tasked with its safekeeping. Some researchers propose that the craft are stored in conditions approximating the environments from which they were allegedly recovered. This theory suggests climate-controlled facilities maintaining specific atmospheric compositions, temperature ranges, and even gravitational conditions if such manipulation proves possible at scale. The reasoning follows conservation principles used in museums and archives, the idea that materials remain stable when kept in states similar to those in which they were found. Crash-retrieved objects might be stored in chambers filled with inert gases to prevent oxidation or chemical degradation, their atmospheres carefully monitored and adjusted, while intact craft could require environmental parameters that mimic their operational conditions, whatever those might be, to prevent unknown deterioration or the loss of properties that only manifest under specific circumstances. Others suggest that the storage is less about preservation and more about containment, facilities designed primarily to prevent the technology from being activated either accidentally or intentionally. This approach treats the craft not as inert objects but as potentially active systems that might respond to certain stimuli, powering on or initiating sequences that could prove dangerous without proper understanding of their function. Such facilities would incorporate electromagnetic shielding, possibly Faraday cages scaled to building size, preventing any external signals from reaching the stored objects and any internal emanations from escaping. The buildings themselves might be constructed with layers of different materials, each serving specific isolation purposes, creating nested barriers between the technology and the outside world. The concept of distributed storage appears in multiple theoretical frameworks. The idea that recovered materials are not kept in a single location, but spread across various facilities to minimize risk and compartmentalize knowledge. Under this model, Area 51 might house certain components or craft, while other installations hold additional pieces, each site operating with limited awareness of what exists at other locations, personnel at one facility unable to construct a complete picture of the full scope of recovered technology. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio frequently appears in these theories, mentioned in historical documents as a destination for unusual materials, while other locations like Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico or the sprawling underground facilities rumored to exist beneath the Denver area feature in various accounts, creating a network of storage and study sites connected by classified transportation routes and shared security protocols. Underground storage presents particular advantages for maintaining secrecy and environmental stability. The Nevada test site adjacent to Area 51 and honeycombed with tunnels from decades of nuclear weapons testing offers ready-made subterranean spaces where temperature remains constant year-round, and natural shielding from radiation and electromagnetic interference already exists. Some theories place the actual storage facilities not in the visible hangars at Groom Lake, but in excavated chambers deep beneath the mountains, accessed through tunnels that show no surface indication of their existence. These underground installations could extend for miles, their galleries large enough to house multiple craft, with laboratories and workshops carved from living rock, the entire complex hidden beneath hundreds of feet of overburden that would defeat most remote sensing attempts. The question of how researchers would interact with stored technology generates its own theoretical considerations. Direct contact might be restricted or prohibited entirely, scientists limited to observation through barriers or remote manipulation using robotic systems, particularly if the materials prove radioactive or emit unknown forms of radiation that standard protective equipment cannot adequately shield against. Specialized cleanroom protocols might govern any physical access. Personnel required to undergo extensive decontamination, both entering and leaving the storage areas. Each object could be assigned specific handling procedures based on its observed properties, some perhaps requiring no special precautions while others demand elaborate safeguards, the differentiation itself revealing information about which items have exhibited active or potentially hazardous characteristics. Some theories incorporate the possibility of the technology being dormant, craft that once functioned but have since become inert through damage, lack of some critical component, or the simple passage of time separating them from their power sources or operational parameters. This dormancy would simplify storage considerably, reducing the technology to elaborate but ultimately passive materials that pose no immediate threat and require no extraordinary containment measures beyond preventing corrosion and unauthorized access. However, this theory also raises questions about whether such technology could be reactivated, whether dormancy represents a permanent state or merely a temporary pause awaiting the proper stimulus, some combination of conditions or inputs that might restore functionality if inadvertently or intentionally provided. The institutional memory required to maintain long-term storage programs presents its own challenges. Personnel rotate through positions, retire, pass away, and as decades accumulate, the original handlers and researchers give way to successive generations who inherit both the technology and the accumulated knowledge about it, though that knowledge transfer cannot always be complete or precise when so much remains classified and compartmented. Documented procedures might exist in secure archives, detailed instructions for storage maintenance and safety protocols, but the experiential knowledge, the subtle understanding gained through years of direct work with the materials, proves harder to preserve. Each generation of scientists and security personnel must build their own relationship with whatever rests in those storage areas, learning through controlled exposure and careful documentation what their predecessors discovered through trial and error. There exists too the theory that some materials or craft remain in private contract facilities, removed from direct military control and housed within the research complexes of aerospace companies, working under classification so deep that even congressional oversight becomes effectively impossible. This privatization of storage would place the technology nominally in civilian hands, while maintaining governmental oversight through contract stipulations and embedded security personnel, creating a legal structure that complicates freedom of information requests and shields the programs from certain forms of public accountability. Companies specializing in advanced materials research or propulsion systems might provide ideal cover for the study of recovered technology, their legitimate commercial work masking more exotic projects. The line between the development of terrestrial innovations and the reverse engineering of non-human designs deliberately blurred to the point of invisibility. The psychology of those who maintain these storage facilities, if they exist, would be shaped by the constant presence of the unexplained, working daily with objects whose origins remain uncertain, whose functions are only partially understood, whose very existence challenges the boundaries of accepted science, would require a particular temperament, capable of living comfortably with ambiguity while maintaining the discipline necessary for rigorous documentation and safety compliance. These individuals would occupy a liminal space between knowing and not knowing, custodians of secrets they themselves may not fully comprehend, charged with preserving mysteries that offer no guarantee of eventual resolution. The theories spiral outward, each attempting to solve the puzzle of how the impossible might be made manageable, how the unknown could be contained within the known frameworks of military logistics and scientific inquiry. Whether any of them approximate reality remains as obscured as the objects they attempt to describe, hidden behind classifications and compartments, denied in official statements while persisting in testimony, and leaked fragments that never quite coalesce into verifiable proof but never quite dissolve into complete dismissal either. Chapter 7. Alleged Autopsies and Biological Evidence. The claims surrounding biological materials recovered from alleged crash sites occupy the most contested territory in the landscape of Area 51 speculation, touching on questions that move beyond technology and engineering into the realm of anatomy and consciousness. If craft of non-human origin have been retrieved, the possibility exists that those craft carried occupants, beings whose physical forms might reveal as much about their origins as any propulsion system or hull material could. The stories that have emerged over decades speak of bodies preserved in specialized facilities, examined by medical professionals sworn to secrecy, their findings documented in reports that remain locked in vaults, or perhaps destroyed entirely to eliminate any paper trail that might someday be subject to disclosure requests. These accounts range from the specific to the vague, from detailed descriptions of autopsy procedures to second-hand rumors that dissolve under scrutiny, and separating genuine testimony from hoax and misidentification has proven nearly impossible. The most famous artifact claiming to show such an examination surfaced in 1995, a film purporting to document the autopsy of an extraterrestrial being recovered from the Roswell incident nearly 50 years earlier. The footage showed figures in contamination suits working on a small humanoid form laid out on an examination table, the setting deliberately clinical, the movements methodical and professional. The film was grainy, damaged in ways consistent with age, and presented by a man named Ray Santilli, who claimed to have purchased it from a retired military cameraman. For a time, the footage generated intense debate. Forensic analysts examining the quality of the film stock, medical professionals commenting on the autopsy techniques, skeptics noting inconsistencies in props and procedures that suggested fabrication rather than documentation of historical events. Eventually, Santilli admitted the footage was a reconstruction, though he maintained it was based on authentic film he had seen but could not preserve, a claim that satisfied neither believers nor skeptics and left the entire episode as yet another example of evidence that promised revelation but delivered only additional layers of ambiguity. Yet the Santilli film, for all its ultimate exposure as a creation rather than documentation, tapped into narratives that had circulated for years before its appearance. Multiple witnesses, some anonymous and others willing to attach names to their accounts, described encounters with preserved biological materials at various facilities. A nurse at the base hospital in Roswell claimed to have assisted with initial examinations of bodies recovered from the desert in 1947, describing entities roughly 4 feet tall with disproportionately large heads and eyes, their skin grey and surprisingly fragile, tearing easily under the pressure of examination instruments not designed for such delicate tissue. Her account, related to researchers years after the alleged events, included details about the overwhelming smell that accompanied the bodies, a pungent odour unlike anything she had encountered in medical practice, and the haste with which the materials were removed from the facility, loaded onto transport vehicles and taken to destinations she was not cleared to know. The preservation of biological evidence would present challenges distinct from those involved in storing technology. Organic materials degrade, particularly when removed from whatever environmental conditions maintained their integrity during life, and standard embalming or refrigeration techniques developed for human remains might prove inadequate or inappropriate for physiology that developed under entirely different evolutionary pressures. Some theories suggest the use of cryogenic storage, bodies maintained at temperatures approaching absolute zero, their cellular structures locked in stasis that prevents decay while allowing for repeated examination over years or decades. Other proposals invoke chemical preservation methods, immersion in fluids that prevent bacterial growth and tissue breakdown, though such approaches would alter the materials in ways that might complicate later analysis, the preservative agents themselves becoming confounding factors in any attempt to understand original biological composition. Reports from individuals claiming knowledge of such programs describe facilities within facilities, secure laboratories accessible only to personnel with specialized clearances beyond those required for work with craft or technology. These inner chambers reportedly maintain conditions more stringent than operating rooms, their atmospheres filtered and pressurized, their temperatures regulated to exact specifications, every surface designed for sterilization and documentation. The examinations conducted within these spaces would be exhaustive, every organ system catalogued, every tissue type sampled and analyzed, the goal being to understand not just anatomy but biochemistry, genetics if DNA analogous structures exist, and the fundamental mechanisms by which such beings achieved sentience and technological capability. The data generated by such research would fill archives, requiring its own system of classification and storage, photographs and X-rays and microscopic imagery, chemical analyses and genetic sequencing if such concepts even applied to biology that did not originate on Earth. One recurring element in testimonies involves the difficulty researchers encountered in categorizing what they observed. Descriptions often emphasize how the anatomy seemed simultaneously familiar and alien, humanoid in basic structure, but lacking certain organs or possessing systems whose functions remained mysterious even after thorough examination. The absence of a digestive tract in some accounts, suggesting beings that did not consume food in ways recognizable to human biology. The presence of neural structures far more developed than those in human brains, tissue densities and connection patterns that implied processing capabilities beyond current understanding of how consciousness emerges from biological substrate. These details, if accurate, would pose fundamental questions about parallel evolution and the likelihood of humanoid forms developing independently on different worlds, coincidences that seem statistically improbable unless some common factor shapes the emergence of intelligent life wherever it arises. The psychological impact on those conducting such examinations would be profound. To open a body and find structures that textbooks never described, to apply medical knowledge gained through human anatomy and discover it inadequate or misleading when confronted with physiology from beyond this world, would challenge professional identity at its core. Physicians and biologists trained for years to develop expertise in their fields, and that expertise rests on assumptions about how life functions, assumptions built from Earth-based examples. Encountering life that violated those assumptions while still achieving complexity and intelligence would force a recognition that the patterns we consider universal might be merely local, specific to the conditions and chemistry of this particular planet, and that consciousness can emerge through pathways we have not yet imagined. Some accounts mention living subjects, beings that survived whatever incident brought them into human custody, held in conditions that attempted to provide for their needs while allowing for study and attempted communication. These stories carry an additional ethical dimension, raising questions about captivity and consent, about what obligations might exist toward intelligent beings from other worlds, and whether those obligations were honored or ignored in the name of national security and scientific advancement. The details in such accounts tend toward the troubling, descriptions of entities deteriorating in captivity, unable to survive in Earth's atmosphere or gravitational field for extended periods, their final hours observed and documented with clinical detachment that seems inhuman in its own right. Whether any such events occurred remains as unverified as the claims of recovered craft, testimony without corroboration, stories told by individuals whose credibility varies widely, and whose motivations for speaking remain open to interpretation. The absence of definitive physical evidence accessible to independent researchers means that biological claims rest almost entirely on witness testimony and alleged insider knowledge. No tissue samples have been made available for public analysis, no photographs authenticated beyond doubt, no medical reports released through official channels or leaked with verifiable chains of custody. What exists instead is a collection of narratives, some detailed and consistent, others contradictory and evolving, told by people whose backgrounds range from military service to medical practice, to positions so unverifiable that they might as well be fictional. The frustration this creates for those seeking answers is considerable, each new account adding to the accumulated folklore without providing the hard evidence necessary to move from speculation to confirmation. In the quiet hours of early morning, when the research facilities run skeleton crews and the desert outside lies still beneath stars that have witnessed the entirety of human history, one imagines the storage chambers where such evidence might rest. Stainless steel and sealed environments, preserved forms that once moved and thought and perhaps looked up at their own sky, with questions similar to those we carry, wondering if they were alone or if somewhere among the countless lights overhead, other minds were gazing back, asking the same impossible questions into the vast and patient silence. Chapter 8. Insider Accounts and Leaked Testimonies. The decision to speak carries consequences that extend far beyond the moment of disclosure. Those who work within classified programs sign documents that make silence a legal obligation, violations punishable by imprisonment and financial ruin, their careers and reputations subject to destruction if they cross boundaries drawn in classification stamps and non-disclosure agreements. Yet over the decades, individuals have chosen to speak anyway, some after retirement when the weight of what they knew became heavier than the fear of repercussion, others while still employed, compelled by conscience or frustration to risk everything for the possibility that their testimony might shift public understanding toward truth. Their accounts form a fractured mosaic, pieces that hint at a larger picture while remaining stubbornly incomplete, each voice adding detail to certain areas while leaving others in shadow. One of the earliest significant testimonies came from a man named Philip Corso, who claimed to have served in the Army's Research and Development Division in the years following Roswell. In his book published in 1997, he described a program dedicated to seeding recovered alien technology into the commercial sector, working with defense contractors to reverse engineer materials and devices that would eventually emerge as innovations attributed to human ingenuity. Integrated circuits, fiber optics, night vision equipment, advances that transformed both military and civilian technology, supposedly drawing on principles observed in debris from craft of unknown origin. Corso presented his claims with the authority of military rank and decorated service, but skeptics noted inconsistencies in his timeline and questioned why such revelations would be permitted in published form if they truly compromised national security. His testimony nonetheless resonated, offering a framework for understanding how non-human technology might be integrated into human development without public acknowledgement of its source. The late 1990s and early 2000s saw a proliferation of insider accounts as the internet provided platforms for testimony that traditional media outlets might have dismissed or ignored. Former military personnel spoke at conferences dedicated to UFO research, describing their roles in retrieval operations or security details at facilities where unusual materials were stored. Some accounts aligned with existing narratives, confirming details from other testimonies, while others introduced new elements, expanding the geography of alleged programs beyond Area 51 to include locations worldwide, a network of recovery and research sites that suggested a phenomenon far larger than any single installation could contain. The anonymity that internet forums allowed meant that some voices remained unidentifiable, their credibility impossible to assess, while others provided names and service records that could be verified, though verification of employment did not necessarily validate the extraordinary claims those individuals made about what they encountered during their tenure. A significant moment in the accumulation of insider testimony occurred in 2001, when an organization called the Disclosure Project orchestrated a press conference at the National Press Club in Washington. More than 20 witnesses, including military officers, government officials, and corporate contractors, provided statements describing their involvement with or knowledge of the UFO-related programs. Some spoke of tracking unknown objects on radar, others of examining debris with properties that defied explanation. Still others of briefings where the reality of extraterrestrial contact was discussed as established fact rather than speculation. The event generated media coverage, though mainstream outlets largely treated it with skepticism, and no governmental response emerged beyond the standard denials that had greeted previous claims. For believers, the gathering represented validation, multiple credible witnesses willing to speak publicly, despite potential consequences. For skeptics, it demonstrated how individuals could convince themselves of extraordinary narratives, interpreting ambiguous experiences through frameworks that confirmed pre-existing beliefs. Deathbed confessions occupy a particular category within insider testimonies, carrying an emotional weight derived from the assumption that those approaching the end of life have little reason to lie. Several accounts describe elderly former military or intelligence personnel unburdening themselves of secrets they carried for decades, speaking to family members or researchers in hospital rooms or nursing facilities, their voices weak but their memories apparently clear. One such testimony came from a man who claimed to have been part of a team that recovered materials from a crash site in the southwest during the 1950s, describing how they were instructed to collect every fragment, no matter how small, and how the site was subsequently sanitized to remove any indication that something unusual had occurred there. He spoke of seeing craft that had no obvious means of propulsion, of handling materials that were impossibly light yet resistant to any attempt to cut or deform them, and of being warned that speaking about these experiences would result in consequences not just for him but for his family. The recording of his testimony, made by a grandson in the final weeks of his life, circulated through UFO research communities, analysed for authenticity and consistency. Though without corroborating physical evidence, it remained another voice in the chorus of unverifiable claims. Document leaks have provided occasional glimpses into what might be official acknowledgment of unusual phenomena, though the authenticity of such documents proves difficult to establish conclusively. Papers bearing official letterheads and classification markings surface through various channels, some arriving anonymously in researchers' mailboxes, others appearing on websites dedicated to government transparency and whistleblowing. The Majestic 12 documents, first emerging in the 1980s, purported to show presidential briefings on recovered alien craft and the establishment of a secret committee to manage the implications of contact. Forensic analysis of these papers yielded conflicting conclusions, some experts declaring them obvious forgeries based on anachronistic terminology and formatting inconsistencies, while others found elements that suggested authenticity, or at least sophisticated fabrication by individuals with inside knowledge of governmental procedures. The debate over these documents continues, generating as much heat as light, their status remaining unresolved despite decades of investigation. Intelligence agency personnel represent another source of insider testimony, though their accounts often remain cloaked in the same secrecy that governed their original work. A CIA officer, who spoke under pseudonym, described a program tasked with tracking and analysing reports of unusual aerial phenomena, not for scientific curiosity but for intelligence purposes, attempting to determine whether foreign adversaries had achieved technological breakthroughs that threatened American aerospace superiority. According to this individual, the program encountered cases that could not be attributed to known nations or conventional technology, objects performing maneuvers that violated understood principles of flight, and these incidents generated classified reports that circulated at the highest levels of government, briefings for presidents and security councils where the possibility of non-human intelligence was discussed as a serious strategic concern. Such accounts, when they emerge, offer a different framework for understanding governmental interest in UFOs, positioning the secrecy not as cover-up of contact but as response to an intelligence problem that admits no easy solution. The pattern across these testimonies reveals certain consistencies despite the diversity of witnesses and circumstances. Many describe compartmentalization so extreme that individuals working on related aspects of programs remained unaware of each other's efforts, each person possessing only the fragment of knowledge necessary for their specific role. They speak of being told explicitly that their work was connected to recovered technology, while others inferred this from the unusual properties of materials they were tasked with analyzing or the questions they were instructed to investigate. The psychological burden of this compartmentalization appears frequently in accounts, the frustration of working in isolation without being able to discuss experiences with colleagues or fit individual pieces into any coherent understanding of the whole, and the gradual realization that what they had been part of might have implications far beyond the technical problems they were employed to solve. Some insiders describe not direct involvement but peripheral awareness, knowledge gained through overheard conversations or glimpsed documents, brief exposures to classified information that suggested programs beyond their clearance level. A secretary who processed paperwork related to materials analysis and noticed recurring references to off-world origins in reports she was instructed to file but not read. A maintenance worker at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base who serviced equipment in secure areas and observed researchers examining objects that seemed inconsistent with any aircraft he recognized from decades of working around military aviation. These fragmentary glimpses, if genuine, paint a picture of secrecy maintained not through single massive cover-ups, but through countless small acts of compartmentalization and need-to-know restrictions. A system where the full truth remains accessible to perhaps no single individual, but is instead distributed across many minds, none of whom possess sufficient pieces to reconstruct the complete picture. The question of why some insiders speak while others maintain silence likely involves factors beyond simple adherence to legal obligations. Personal ethics, the sense that democratic societies deserve transparency about matters of such potential significance, competes with institutional loyalty and the belief that some secrets serve legitimate security interests. The varying motivations of those who come forward, whether driven by conscience, desire for vindication, or simple need to unburden themselves before death, colour how their testimonies are received and evaluated. Each account must be weighed not just on its content, but on the character and circumstances of the person speaking, an assessment complicated by the fact that credibility and extraordinary claims often seem inversely proportional. The more dramatic the testimony, the higher the bar for acceptance becomes. In the accumulation of these voices, patterns emerge that might represent genuine consistency, or might simply reflect how stories influence one another, witnesses unconsciously conforming their accounts to narrative templates established by earlier testimonies. The challenge remains separating signal from noise, identifying which claims might be anchored in actual experience and which are elaborations, misrememberings, or deliberate fabrications. Until physical evidence emerges that can be independently verified, or until official acknowledgment provides clarity that secrecy has thus far prevented, the insider accounts remain what they have always been, compelling possibilities suspended between belief and doubt, testimony without tangible proof, voices speaking into a silence that has yet to offer any definitive reply. Chapter 9. The UFO Hotspot Above Area 51. The airspace above Groom Lake has earned a reputation as one of the most active locations on Earth for unexplained aerial phenomena, a designation that exists in curious tension with its status as highly restricted military territory, where unauthorized intrusion invites swift response from both ground and air defense systems. The volume of sightings reported from this region exceeds what would be expected, even accounting for the presence of classified aircraft testing, suggesting either that the base serves as a venue for technology so advanced it appears alien to outside observers, or that the area genuinely attracts or generates phenomena that defy conventional explanation. The distinction between these possibilities has proven difficult to establish, each unusual sighting capable of supporting multiple interpretations depending on the assumptions brought to bear on the observation. What remains undeniable is the sheer frequency with which people report seeing things in the Nevada sky that should not, by any ordinary reckoning, be there. The characteristics described in these sightings follow patterns that have remained remarkably consistent across decades and diverse witnesses. Objects that hover motionless for extended periods, seemingly unaffected by wind conditions that would buffet conventional aircraft, their position fixed with a stability that suggests active control rather than passive suspension. Sudden accelerations that carry these objects from standstill to velocities measured in thousands of miles per hour within seconds. Movements that would subject any human pilot to gravitational forces sufficient to cause blackout or death, yet executed smoothly without apparent transition between states of motion. Right-angle turns at high speed, maneuvers that violate basic principles of momentum and inertia, the objects changing direction instantaneously, as though the constraints of physics applied selectively or not at all. These behaviours appear with such regularity in reports that they have become almost definitional, the expected signature of genuine unidentified phenomena as opposed to misidentified conventional craft or natural atmospheric effects. The lights themselves, when visible, exhibit qualities that witnesses struggle to articulate precisely. Colours that seem purer than those produced by known illumination technology, reds and oranges and whites that carry an intensity suggesting enormous energy output, yet without the glare or diffusion that would accompany such brightness in familiar light sources. Some observers describe a pulsing quality, the light expanding and contracting rhythmically, while others note complete steadiness, an unwavering glow that maintains constant luminosity, regardless of the object's motion or maneuvers. Occasionally, multiple lights appear in formation, triangular or linear arrangements that move in perfect coordination, maintaining their relative positions through accelerations and turns that would require either multiple piloted craft, executing impossibly precise choreography, or a single large structure with light sources at its extremities, though no connecting surface can typically be discerned even when observation conditions are favourable. Radar returns from the restricted airspace have occasionally surfaced through channels both official and unauthorised, data showing tracks that correspond to visual sightings, while adding layers of objective measurement to subjective observation. These returns sometimes display characteristics that radar operators describe as anomalous, objects appearing and disappearing from screens without following predictable flight paths. Their radar cross-sections varying in ways inconsistent with known aircraft, signatures that might indicate stealth technology or might suggest something else entirely, vehicles whose interaction with electromagnetic radiation follows unfamiliar principles, air traffic controllers at civilian facilities whose coverage extends toward the restricted zones, report tracking objects at altitudes and speeds that exceed the performance envelopes of any acknowledged aircraft, watching them on screens while being unable to establish radio communication or receive transponder signals that would identify the craft through standard aviation protocols. The timing of sightings clusters around certain hours, with the period between midnight and pre-dawn showing particularly high activity levels. This pattern could reflect operational preferences for testing classified systems under cover of darkness, reduced visibility limiting public observation of sensitive programs, or it might indicate that whatever phenomena occur manifest more readily in darkness, for reasons unrelated to human scheduling considerations. Witnesses who maintain regular vigils at viewing locations report being able to predict with reasonable accuracy when unusual activity is likely to occur, though these predictions rest on accumulated experience rather than any published schedule or confirmed understanding of what drives the timing. Certain nights prove more active than others, with multiple sightings occurring in rapid succession, objects appearing individually or in groups, their movements sometimes seeming coordinated and purposeful, other times apparently random, lacking any discernible pattern or objective. The proximity of Area 51 to other significant locations adds another dimension to the concentration of sightings in this region. The Nevada test site, where hundreds of nuclear weapons were detonated during atmospheric and underground testing programs, lies immediately adjacent to the restricted zones around Groom Lake. Some researchers have proposed connections between nuclear activity and UFO sightings, noting increased reports of unusual phenomena at sites associated with nuclear weapons development, testing, and storage worldwide. Whether this correlation indicates monitoring by external intelligences concerned with humanity's most destructive capabilities, or whether nuclear facilities simply attract more attention and thus more misidentifications and fabrications, remains open to interpretation. The pattern exists in data compiled across multiple continents and decades, though causation has never been established beyond the statistical association. Photographic documentation of the phenomena above Area 51 suffers from the same limitations that plague UFO photography generally, the challenges of capturing clear images of distant objects in darkness or against bright sky. Even when photographs and videos show anomalous lights or shapes, the footage rarely provides sufficient detail to eliminate prosaic explanations, the gap between what the camera records and what the witness perceives often being substantial. The human eye and brain process visual information differently than digital sensors and film, integrating context and movement in ways that create certainty in the observer that cannot be fully conveyed through recorded media. This disconnect has generated frustration on all sides, witnesses insisting their documentation captures genuine phenomena, while skeptics point to the ambiguity inherent in distant lights against dark backgrounds, neither position fully acknowledging the limitations of translating three-dimensional, real-time experience into two-dimensional static or video evidence. Military pilots, both active duty and retired, have contributed accounts of encounters with unusual objects in the airspace, around and above the restricted zones. These testimonies carry particular weight given the observers' training in aircraft identification and their familiarity with high-performance flight characteristics, though they also invite questions about whether pilots might encounter classified programs unknown even to other military personnel seeing advanced technology under development and interpreting it as something beyond terrestrial origin. One former fighter pilot described an incident where his flight encountered multiple objects that appeared on radar and visually, craft that paced his formation for several minutes before accelerating away at speeds he estimated exceeded Mach 5, far beyond the capabilities of any fighter jet in existence at the time. The encounter was logged and reported through official channels, where it presumably joined other incident reports in classified databases that remain inaccessible to public scrutiny. Commercial airline crews occasionally report unusual phenomena when their flight paths take them near the restricted zones, though these reports typically remain internal to airlines and aviation authorities, rarely reaching public awareness unless the crew chooses to speak independently. Pilots and flight attendants have described seeing lights keeping pace with their aircraft at cruising altitude, objects that maintain position relative to the plane for extended periods before departing at impossible velocities, and in some cases, near-miss situations where something passed close enough to the aircraft to constitute a safety hazard, yet left no trace on collision avoidance systems and generated no communication from air traffic control, as though the object existed in visual space, but not in the electromagnetic environment that modern aviation relies upon for tracking and separation. These incidents create tension between the desire to report safety concerns and the professional reputations at stake when pilots describe encounters that might be dismissed as misperceptions or hallucinations. The question of whether the phenomena represent observation or interaction, passive monitoring or active engagement, appears in multiple accounts with unsettling frequency. Witnesses sometimes describe feeling observed, a sensation of attention being directed toward them from the objects in the sky, though such subjective impressions resist verification and might represent psychological projection rather than actual contact. Others report more overt interactions, objects that seem to respond to human presence or actions, lights that approach when observers signal with flashlights or mirrors, craft that alter their behavior in ways that suggest awareness of being watched. These responsive behaviors, if genuine, would indicate intelligence behind the phenomena, purposeful action rather than automated systems or natural occurrences, though they might equally represent coincidence misinterpreted through the human tendency to find patterns and meaning in random events. As dawn approaches and the stars fade into morning light, the desert sky above Groom Lake returns to apparent normalcy, empty blue stretching toward horizons where mountains rise against the coming day. Whatever moves through that airspace in darkness either departs or becomes invisible against daylight, and the cycle prepares to repeat when evening falls again, the same coordinates hosting the same unexplained activity that has characterized this location for decades, a hotspot where the boundary between the known and unknown grows thin enough that crossing it, in either direction, seems almost inevitable. Chapter 10. The Element 115. Mystery. At the heart of Bob Lazar's testimony lies a claim both specific and extraordinary, an assertion about matter itself that bridges the gap between observable chemistry and speculative physics. He described element 115, a substance not found naturally on Earth, as the fuel source for the propulsion systems he claimed to have studied at S4. This element, according to Lazar, possessed properties that allowed it to generate gravitational fields when subjected to bombardment by protons, distorting space-time in ways that enabled the craft to move without conventional thrust, pulling themselves through space by creating localized warps in the fabric of reality itself. The claim was bold enough to be testable, rooted in the periodic table, and therefore subject to eventual verification or refutation, once science advanced sufficiently to synthesize super-heavy elements in laboratory conditions, a moment that would arrive years after Lazar first spoke the name of this mysterious material into public record. The periodic table, as it existed when Lazar made his initial claims in 1989, extended only to element 109. Element 115 represented territory that physicists predicted might exist but had not yet reached, part of the theoretical island of stability where super-heavy elements might possess lifespans measured in something other than milliseconds, potentially remaining intact long enough to study their properties or even utilize them in practical applications. Lazar's description of element 115 as stable, existing in sufficient quantities to serve as fuel, aligned with these theoretical predictions in ways that lent his account an aura of plausibility to those unfamiliar with the nuances of nuclear physics. He spoke of the element being mined or obtained from elsewhere, suggesting origins beyond this solar system, material brought to Earth as part of the same craft that would eventually come into human possession, a complete package of technology, and the exotic matter required to make that technology function. The gravitational amplification properties Lazar attributed to element 115 formed the cornerstone of his explanation for how the craft achieved their impossible maneuvers. According to his account, the element produced gravity waves when its nucleus was bombarded with protons in a small reactor. These waves then directed and focused through waveguides to create a distortion field around the craft. This field would effectively reduce the distance between the craft and its destination by warping space itself, allowing travel that appeared to violate speed limitations, but actually occurred through a different mechanism entirely, one that circumvented rather than exceeded light speed constraints. The explanation drew on concepts from general relativity, Einstein's description of gravity as curvature in space-time, but applied them in ways that mainstream physics regarded as impractical, if not impossible, with any known or theoretically accessible energy source. In 2003, a team of scientists working at the Joint Institute for Nuclear Research in Russia succeeded in synthesizing element 115 for the first time, creating a few atoms through collision experiments that forced calcium nuclei into americium targets. The achievement represented a significant advancement in super-heavy element research, confirming that the periodic table extended into regions Lazar had mentioned years earlier, lending a superficial credibility to his claims about having worked with this specific element. However, the element 115 that scientists created bore little resemblance to the stable fuel source Lazar described. The synthesized atoms decayed in fractions of a second, their existence measured in milliseconds before radioactive breakdown transformed them into lighter elements, nowhere near the stability required for practical use as fuel or for the gravitational properties Lazar had attributed to the material. The element was eventually named moscovium in 2016, officially recognized and added to the periodic table after independent verification of its synthesis. The naming ceremony represented a triumph of nuclear physics, the culmination of decades of effort to push the boundaries of matter into increasingly unstable territory, but it also highlighted the discrepancy between theoretical predictions and Lazar's specific claims. All known isotopes of moscovium demonstrated extreme instability, and while physics allows for the possibility of an island of stability, where certain isotopes of super-heavy elements might persist longer than their neighbours, no evidence has emerged to suggest that element 115 possesses isotopes stable enough to handle, let alone use as fuel in quantities sufficient to power spacecraft. The gap between what science has achieved and what Lazar described remains as wide as it was when he first made his claims, perhaps wider, given that actual synthesis has revealed behaviour contrary to his account. Supporters of Lazar's testimony point out that the specific isotope matters enormously in determining an element's properties, and that the isotopes scientists have successfully created represent only a tiny fraction of the theoretically possible configurations of protons and neutrons that might constitute element 115. They argue that an isotope with a different neutron count could exhibit the stability Lazar described, existing in the predicted island where nuclear forces balance in ways that prevent rapid decay. This defense cannot be easily dismissed because the physics of super-heavy elements remains incompletely understood, and predicting which specific isotopes might achieve unusual stability involves calculations so complex that different theoretical approaches yield conflicting results. The possibility exists, at least in the abstract space of what physics permits rather than what has been demonstrated, that Lazar encountered a form of element 115 that science has not yet synthesized, or perhaps cannot synthesize given the limitations of terrestrial nuclear facilities. Critics focus on other aspects of Lazar's elemental claims that prove more problematic. His descriptions of how the element generates gravitational fields involve misunderstandings of fundamental physics, conflating gravity waves with gravitational fields in ways that suggest confusion between distinct phenomena, and his explanation of how these effects could be amplified and directed lacks any basis in established theory or experimental observation. Gravity, as understood through general relativity, emerges from mass energy distributions warping space-time, not from bombardment of atomic nuclei with particles, and no known mechanism would allow a small reactor to generate the kind of space-time distortions Lazar described. These errors, to trained physicists, indicate someone repeating technical-sounding concepts without deep comprehension, mixing legitimate terms with impossible claims in ways that create narratives satisfying to lay audiences but nonsensical to experts. The question of where such material might have originated adds another layer to the mystery. If element 115 in a stable form exists anywhere, it would require synthesis in environments far more energetic than those found on Earth, perhaps in the nuclear furnaces of neutron stars, or in the aftermath of stellar collisions where extreme conditions briefly permit the creation of super-heavy elements before scattering them into space. Advanced civilizations with understanding beyond our current physics might have developed techniques for creating and stabilizing isotopes that our theories suggest should be impossible, or the element might occur naturally in regions of the galaxy where stellar evolution has proceeded differently than in our local neighborhood. These speculations venture far beyond verifiable science into the realm of educated guessing, attempts to construct scenarios where Lazar's claims could be accommodated within extended versions of known physics, though such accommodation requires generous assumptions about both alien capabilities and gaps in human understanding. The sample Lazar claimed to have taken from S4, a small amount of element 115 that he suggested he had briefly possessed before it was recovered by authorities, has never surfaced for independent analysis. Without physical evidence that can be subjected to mass spectrometry and other analytical techniques, the entire discussion remains theoretical, arguments about what might be possible rather than examination of what actually exists. This absence of material evidence forms a recurring pattern in Area 51 testimonies, claims about extraordinary materials and technology that somehow never become available for the rigorous testing that would settle questions definitively. Whether this pattern reflects the effectiveness of security measures preventing leakage of classified materials, or simply indicates that the materials never existed outside of narrative, depends largely on prior assumptions about the credibility of the witnesses and the plausibility of their accounts. The element 115 mystery thus persists in an uncomfortable space between vindication and refutation. Lazar was correct that such an element would eventually be synthesized, though whether this represents genuine foreknowledge or simply familiarity with predictions already present in physics, literature remains debatable. He was incorrect about its stability and properties as science currently understands them, though the possibility of unknown isotopes provides a thin thread by which his defenders can maintain that future discoveries might yet align with his descriptions. What cannot be disputed is that his claims about this specific element have become inextricably woven into the larger narrative surrounding Area 51, one more thread in a tapestry where fact and speculation intertwine so thoroughly that separating them may prove impossible without evidence that transcends testimony, without matter that can be weighed and measured and tested, until it yields answers that no amount of debate or analysis of words alone can provide. The laboratories where super-heavy elements are created continue their work, pushing deeper into the periodic table, synthesizing atoms that exist for briefer and briefer moments before decay reclaims them. Each new element discovered maps a little more of the territory, where nuclear forces balance on knife edges, where matter itself becomes increasingly improbable, and perhaps somewhere in that unmapped territory, isotopes wait that would surprise everyone, stable islands in seas of decay where physics permits what has not yet been achieved, where Lazar's claims and scientific reality might finally meet. Chapter 11. Strange Lights over Groom Lake. The lights appear first as uncertainty, a brightening against darkness that might be a star descending or imagination given form, something the eye almost dismisses before it registers as real and present and moving in ways that stars do not move. They emerge from behind mountain ridges or materialize mid-sky, as though switching on rather than approaching, and in those first moments of observation, witnesses often report a peculiar suspension of belief, a mental pause while the mind attempts to categorize what it perceives according to familiar frameworks before accepting that no familiar category quite fits. The phenomenon has repeated itself so many times over so many years that it has developed its own phenomenology, a catalogue of characteristics and behaviours that observers have learned to recognise. The recognition brings understanding no closer than the first sighting did decades ago. These are not the predictable lights of commercial aviation, with their measured blinks and steady trajectories, nor the obvious flares deployed during military exercises, burning bright and falling in arcs that gravity dictates. These lights possess agency, intentionality written in movement patterns that suggest control rather than drift. The colours shift in ways that natural atmospheric phenomena rarely achieve, transitioning through spectrum bands with deliberation that seems almost communicative. Orange giving way to white, white intensifying to blue-white brilliance before cycling back through amber and red, the changes occurring smoothly or in distinct steps depending on the individual light and the particular evening's display. Some witnesses describe the colours as having depth, as though viewing them through layers of atmosphere that shouldn't exist at the altitudes where the lights appear, a quality of luminescence that seems to originate from within rather than being reflected or projected. Cameras struggle to capture these chromatic variations accurately, the sensors translating the colours into something flatter and less nuanced than what human eyes perceive. Another instance where recorded evidence fails to convey the full strangeness of direct observation. Particular incidents have achieved legendary status among those who frequent the viewing areas, stories told and retold with variations that accumulate around core facts like sediment around fossils. The night in March of 1989 when Bob Lazar brought a group of friends to witness a scheduled test, and the lights appeared exactly as he predicted they would, rising from the direction of Papoose Lake and performing manoeuvres that the assembled witnesses documented on videotape. The footage shows points of light against the dark mass of mountains, the objects ascending vertically before executing movements that conventional aircraft would require wide turning radii to accomplish. The lights shifting position instantaneously, hovering, then accelerating away at velocities that appear to violate inertial constraints. This particular sighting holds significance because it was anticipated rather than random, predicted by someone claiming inside knowledge, lending weight to arguments that the lights represent controlled testing, rather than natural phenomena or misidentified conventional flights. Other memorable nights lack such context but compensate with sheer visual drama. Multiple lights appearing in formation, geometric arrangements that hold their relative positions while the entire configuration rotates or translates across the sky, suggesting either coordinated individual objects or a single large structure with multiple light sources at fixed points. Witnesses to these formation flights often comment on the precision involved, the way the lights maintain exact spacing through complex maneuvers, and the absence of any visible connecting structure between them, though darkness makes such observations inconclusive. Triangle formations appear with particular frequency, 3 lights arranged at the vertices of isosceles or equilateral triangles, sometimes accompanied by additional lights at the centre or along the edges, creating patterns that move as unified wholes, while individual lights occasionally break away to perform independent movements before rejoining the formation. The duration of sightings varies enormously, from brief appearances lasting seconds to extended observations spanning hours. Some lights simply vanish, not moving away beyond the horizon or behind topographic features but switching off instantaneously as though a power source was interrupted, while others fade gradually or depart at high speed, dwindling to points before disappearing into distance. The longer observations allow witnesses to note details and patterns that brief sightings cannot provide, the way certain lights pulse with regular periodicity while others remain constant, the tendency for some objects to hover at fixed positions for extended intervals as though stationed there for purpose unknown before resuming movement. These extended viewings test patience and challenge the capacity for sustained attention, hours of watching, that yield both moments of intense activity and long periods where little appears to happen, the lights present but inactive, maintaining position without obvious objective. The sound accompanying the lights, or more accurately the absence of sound, constitutes one of their most consistently reported characteristics. Objects moving at the velocities observers describe should generate sonic booms, shock waves audible for miles, yet the lights typically appear and maneuver in complete silence, creating cognitive dissonance between visual observation and auditory expectation. On occasions when sound is reported, it takes forms unlike conventional aircraft noise, low-frequency hums or high-pitched tones that seem to carry poorly, audible at certain locations while inaudible at others, despite similar lines of sight to the source. This acoustic signature, or lack thereof, adds another layer of strangeness to the phenomenon, suggesting either technology that circumvents the normal relationship between motion through atmosphere and sound generation, or alternatively that the objects operate at altitudes or through mechanisms where air displacement occurs differently than conventional aerodynamics would predict. Local residents who have spent years or decades living near the restricted zones develop a casual familiarity with the lights that contrasts sharply with the excitement of first-time observers. For them, the phenomenon becomes part of the environment's ambient characteristics, noted but no longer remarkable, the way city dwellers stop registering traffic noise or coastal inhabitants cease to consciously hear breaking waves. This normalization speaks to the regularity with which unusual lights appear, frequent enough that they transition from extraordinary to ordinary for those continuously exposed, though their underlying nature remains as mysterious to long-time observers as to newcomers. When interviewed, these residents often express a pragmatic acceptance, acknowledging that something unusual occurs in their night skies, while declining to speculate extensively about its origin or purpose, content to coexist with mystery rather than demanding resolution. The relationship between the lights and ground-based activity at Groom Lake sometimes reveals correlations that suggest connection without proving it definitively. Increased security presence along the perimeter often precedes nights of heightened light activity, suggesting advanced knowledge among those responsible for protecting the restricted zones that testing or operations likely to generate public observation will occur. Conversely, some of the most dramatic light displays occur with no apparent preparation or increased security measures, as though the phenomena either arise spontaneously or follow schedules known to some but not reflected in observable security postures. These inconsistencies frustrate attempts to predict sightings or establish reliable patterns that would allow systematic documentation, the lights appearing according to logic that external observers cannot fully discern from limited vantage points and incomplete information. Scientific explanations proposed for the lights range from the prosaic to the speculative, each accounting for some observed characteristics while failing to address others. Atmospheric plasma phenomena, ball lightning, temperature inversions creating mirages, all enter the discussion as possible mundane causes, yet none explain the apparent controlled movement or the extended durations many sightings exhibit. Secret aircraft testing remains the explanation most skeptics favour. Advanced propulsion systems or unconventional aerospace designs generating visual effects that appear anomalous to observers lacking classified knowledge of current capabilities. This explanation accommodates many observations while requiring acceptance that testing occurs with frequency and visibility that seems careless, given the resources invested in maintaining secrecy around the facility, a contradiction that proponents resolve by suggesting the visibility itself serves purposes, either testing public response or using genuine phenomena as cover for even more classified programs. The lights have become symbols, their ambiguity allowing them to represent whatever observers need them to represent. To some, they offer hope that humanity stands at the threshold of contact with intelligence beyond Earth, physical evidence appearing nightly that we are not alone in a universe that often feels vast and empty. To others, they demonstrate the impressive capabilities of human engineering, proof that our species continues to push technological boundaries in secret programs that will eventually emerge into public knowledge. Still others see them as warnings or indicators of surveillance, monitoring by forces whose intentions remain opaque but whose presence demands acknowledgement. The lights themselves offer no clarification, continuing their patterns and behaviours indifferent to interpretation, objects or phenomena that exist independent of human attempts to assign them meaning or purpose. As darkness deepens in the hours before dawn, when the desert cold settles most intensely, and the stars wheel toward morning, those who watch sometimes report a sense of connection to something larger than individual curiosity. The lights, whatever they are, represent possibility, questions without answers, mystery that persists despite decades of observation and speculation, and in a world that increasingly offers explanations for everything. The unexplained holds its own value, a reminder that darkness still conceals wonders we have not yet brought fully into light. Chapter 12. government silence, and the 2013 acknowledgment. For decades, the official position remained remarkably consistent in its refusal to acknowledge what satellite photographs clearly revealed and what every aviation enthusiast with access to topographic maps already knew. The facility at Groom Lake, visible from orbit and documented in countless images showing runways and hangars sprawling across the desert floor, did not officially exist according to governmental responses to inquiries and freedom of information requests. Spokespeople deflected questions with practiced non-answers, neither confirming nor denying the presence of installations whose existence was evident to anyone who cared to look, creating a peculiar situation where reality and official statement occupied separate domains with no apparent intersection. This wall of silence served multiple purposes, providing legal cover for classification, while simultaneously feeding the speculation and mythology that transformed a remote test facility into the most famous secret base in the world, its very namelessness becoming a brand more recognizable than most officially acknowledged military installations. The culture of secrecy surrounding classified aerospace programs rests on foundations that extend beyond simple military necessity. During the Cold War, when American and Soviet engineers raced to develop weapons and delivery systems capable of ensuring mutual destruction, the imperative to protect technological advantages from adversary intelligence services justified extraordinary measures of compartmentalization and denial. Programs like the U-2 spy plane and later the SR-71 Blackbird achieved remarkable capabilities that provided genuine strategic benefits, and the secrecy that shielded their development from Soviet awareness served clear national security interests. Area 51 played central roles in these programs, its isolation and controlled airspace providing ideal conditions for testing aircraft that needed to remain hidden until their capabilities could be deployed operationally. And the precedent established by these legitimate secret projects created infrastructure and culture that would persist long after the specific threats that justified them had evolved or dissolved. But secrecy, once institutionalized, develops its own momentum independent of the threats that originally warranted it. Classification systems designed to protect information become mechanisms for controlling narratives and limiting accountability, the stamps and clearances and compartments multiplying until even determining what should remain secret and what might safely be disclosed becomes itself a classified determination. Entire categories of information disappear behind barriers where their necessity for protection cannot be evaluated by anyone outside the system that created those barriers, and the result is a self-perpetuating cycle where secrecy breeds more secrecy, each new program classified not necessarily because its exposure would harm national interests, but because it exists within a framework where classification represents the default rather than the exception. Area 51 became emblematic of this tendency, a place where the actual sensitive projects mixed with speculation and myth, until separating legitimate secrets from elaborated mysteries proved impossible for anyone lacking access to classified documentation. The arguments justifying continued silence evolved as geopolitical circumstances changed. After the Soviet Union's collapse, the rationale shifted from denying intelligence to adversaries toward protecting technological advantages in an era of global proliferation and asymmetric threats. The capabilities being tested in Nevada's restricted zones supposedly represented innovations that, if revealed prematurely, might be countered by hostile forces developing defensive measures or pursuing parallel research that would negate American superiority. This logic contains validity when applied to genuine cutting-edge technology, though it also provides convenient cover for extending classification far beyond what strategic necessity might strictly require. The absence of external oversight meant that decisions about what information threatened security and what merely threatened bureaucratic preference or contractor profits occurred without meaningful review, the classifiers themselves determining the necessity of their classifications in a system notably resistant to accountability. Then, in August of 2013, something shifted. The Central Intelligence Agency released documents in response to a Freedom of Information request filed years earlier by researchers seeking records related to the U-2 program, and within those heavily redacted pages appeared explicit acknowledgement of a facility at Groom Lake, referred to by the designation that had been unofficial shorthand for decades. Area 51 existed, the documents confirmed, a CIA installation used for testing reconnaissance aircraft, its location marked on maps included in the release, its purpose described in clinical language stripped of the drama and speculation that had accumulated around the site. The acknowledgment was presented without fanfare or press conference, simply released as part of routine document disclosure, as though confirming the existence of one of the world's most famous secret facilities represented nothing particularly noteworthy or significant. What the documents revealed proved simultaneously substantial and disappointing to those hoping for validation of more exotic theories. They described the selection process for the location, military and CIA officials seeking isolated terrain with good weather and proximity to existing infrastructure, the dry lake bed at Groom Lake meeting requirements for a facility that needed long sight lines and minimal public observation. They detailed the development of the U-2, the technical challenges involved in creating an aircraft capable of flying above Soviet radar coverage, and the testing protocols that transformed an abandoned airstrip into a functional facility for some of the most sensitive aerospace work of the Cold War era. The narrative presented was one of impressive engineering achievement and practical security measures, human ingenuity applied to difficult problems under pressures of international competition. Nothing in the released pages suggesting contact with non-human intelligence or the study of technology from beyond Earth. The reaction to this official acknowledgement split along predictable lines. Skeptics declared vindication, pointing to the documents as proof that Area 51's actual purpose involved exactly what informed observers had long suspected: classified but conventional aerospace testing without exotic elements beyond what human science and engineering could produce. Those convinced of deeper secrets noted the extensive redactions throughout the documents, entire sections blacked out, references to programs whose names remained classified, appendices withheld entirely on grounds of national security. They argued with some justification that confirmation of Area 51's role in U-2 development said nothing about what else might occur or have occurred at the facility, that acknowledging one program's existence did not preclude others remaining classified, and that the timing of the release, coming decades after the Cold War's conclusion, suggested careful curation of what information entered public domain. The acknowledgement altered the conversation around Area 51 while leaving fundamental questions unresolved. No longer could the facility's very existence be denied, which removed one layer of official obfuscation but did nothing to address claims about programs beyond reconnaissance aircraft development. The documents created a framework of confirmed facts around which speculation could reorganize itself, some theories collapsing under the weight of mundane explanation while others adapted, incorporating the new information while maintaining claims about activities not addressed in the declassified pages. The release functioned as both disclosure and deflection, providing enough transparency to appear responsive to public interest while maintaining the classification barriers that prevented any comprehensive understanding of the facility's full history and current operations. Later declassifications added details to specific programs. The existence of the Have-Blue prototype that evolved into the F-117 stealth fighter confirmed along with its testing at Groom Lake during the late 1970s and early 1980s. These revelations demonstrated that Area 51 had indeed served as venue for revolutionary aerospace development, aircraft whose capabilities seemed impossible, according to public understanding of aviation when they were being tested. Their angular facetted surfaces designed to scatter radar returns, representing genuine innovations that temporarily gave American military forces significant advantages. The stealth fighter's acknowledgement provided context for some UFO sightings, their unusual shapes and silent approach profiles capable of generating reports of unconventional craft from witnesses unfamiliar with their existence. Yet this explanation, while accounting for certain incidents, failed to address the full range of phenomena reported from the area, sightings that preceded the stealth program's timeline or described characteristics beyond what even revolutionary conventional aircraft could demonstrate. The pattern established by the 2013 acknowledgement suggested a strategy of selective disclosure, confirming programs after sufficient time has passed that revelation no longer threatens operational security while maintaining silence around current activities and any programs whose exposure might generate consequences beyond simple loss of tactical advantage. This approach allows governmental institutions to appear responsive to transparency demands, while retaining control over what information enters public discourse, and when that entry occurs, the decades-long delays between program operation and acknowledgement ensuring that by the time confirmation arrives, the strategic landscape has shifted sufficiently that the information no longer carries contemporary relevance. For those seeking answers about what Area 51 houses in the present, rather than what it developed in the past, the declassifications offer little comfort. Their existence proof that secrets can be kept for generations, and that official acknowledgment, when it finally comes, may arrive too late to satisfy the questions that drove the search for answers. The silence that remains, the vast territory of unacknowledged activity in classified programs, still protected by security oaths and federal law, stands as the more significant reality than what has been revealed. Each document released creates the illusion of transparency while actually defining the boundaries of what cannot be discussed, the edges of disclosed information marking where deeper secrets begin, and those who have worked within classified programs understand that the most sensitive operations maintain protection precisely because their exposure would generate consequences that time does not mitigate, truths that do not become safe to acknowledge merely because years have passed since events occurred or discoveries were made. Chapter 13 Unanswered Alien Secrets of Area 51. The fundamental questions persist with a stubbornness that decades of investigation have failed to erode, each new piece of information adding complexity rather than clarity, the puzzle growing larger rather than resolving toward coherence. Does recovered technology from non-human sources rest in climate-controlled facilities beneath Nevada mountains, or does Area 51 house only the remarkable but entirely terrestrial achievements of human engineering operating at the edges of what physics and materials science permit? Have representatives of our species engaged in dialogue with intelligences from beyond this world, establishing protocols and exchanges that remain classified for reasons of social stability or strategic advantage, or do the testimonies describing such contact represent misunderstandings, fabrications, and the human tendency to interpret ambiguous experiences through frameworks that satisfy deeper psychological needs for meaning and transcendence? These questions do not yield to analysis or accumulation of anecdotal evidence, existing instead in a state of permanent suspension between possibilities that cannot be definitively proven or disproven given the information available to those outside classified channels. The structure of secrecy itself becomes part of the mystery, making verification impossible by design. If extraordinary programs exist, they would be protected by the same mechanisms that shield conventional classified work, and those mechanisms function precisely by creating plausible deniability and compartmentalization that prevents comprehensive understanding. Witnesses can be discredited through erasure of employment records or by highlighting inconsistencies that might result from faulty memory or deliberate disinformation rather than fabrication. Physical evidence can be confiscated or explained as misidentified conventional materials. The absence of proof becomes meaningless when the system is explicitly designed to prevent proof from entering public domain, and yet absence of proof cannot be taken as proof of presence either, the logical space between these positions remaining vast and unbridgeable without access that security classifications expressly prohibit. This creates a perfect trap for those seeking truth, where every avenue toward verification leads to barriers that might indicate either legitimate security concerns or elaborate concealment of realities too significant to acknowledge. Consider what it would mean if the most dramatic claims proved accurate. The existence of non-human intelligence possessing technology far beyond current human capabilities would reframe virtually every assumption about our species' place in cosmic order, our uniqueness or lack thereof, our future trajectory and the possibilities available to civilizations that survive their technological adolescence, long enough to develop capabilities we currently imagine only in theoretical papers and science fiction. It would raise immediate questions about why contact remains limited or covert, what circumstances govern interaction between civilizations at vastly different developmental stages, and whether agreements or treaties exist that constrain more open engagement. The social and philosophical implications would cascade through every institution and belief system, though whether such revelation would trigger chaos or ultimately prove liberating depends on factors impossible to predict. The resilience of human civilization in the face of paradigm-shattering information remaining untested at such scales. Alternatively, if Area 51 contains only advanced but entirely human technology, the implications prove less cosmically significant, but perhaps more troubling in their own way. It would mean that classified programs have achieved capabilities so far beyond publicly acknowledged aerospace that they appear to violate known physics, creating a technological gap between secret and open development that raises questions about resource allocation and the opportunity costs of investing enormous sums in programs whose achievements cannot be shared or commercialized. It would suggest that the secrecy apparatus has grown so extensive and self-protective that it maintains classification long past any legitimate security rationale, hoarding knowledge as institutional reflex rather than strategic necessity. And it would confirm that governmental institutions are willing and able to maintain deception at civilizational scale for indefinite periods, neither confirming nor denying in ways that allow speculation to flourish while preventing any resolution that might force accountability or transparency. The witnesses who have spoken carry their testimonies forward into lives that often prove difficult after disclosure. Some face professional consequences, security clearances revoked, and career opportunities vanishing, their credibility attacked by sources that may or may not represent official responses to their violations of secrecy agreements. Others find themselves embraced by communities hungry for validation, their accounts amplified and sometimes embellished, beyond what they originally stated, their nuance lost as their words become ammunition in debates they never intended to join. A few retreat into silence, apparently regretting having spoken at all, while others remain steadfast, repeating their accounts with remarkable consistency across years of interviews and public appearances. Each witness represents a data point in a dataset that refuses to resolve into clear patterns, testimony that might be truthful or mistaken or deliberately misleading, motivated by conscience or attention-seeking or complex psychological factors that even the witnesses themselves might not fully understand. The technological possibilities raised by the more exotic claims push against the boundaries of theoretical physics in ways that reveal both how much we understand and how much remains mysterious. Propulsion systems based on gravity manipulation, if achievable, would require energy densities and control mechanisms that current physics can describe mathematically, but cannot practically implement. The gap between theory and engineering proving as vast as the distance between understanding combustion chemistry and building rocket engines. Materials with properties that no terrestrial manufacturing process can replicate might indicate either fabrication techniques we have not yet developed, or discovery of matter in states that our current models do not predict. Exotic arrangements of atoms or perhaps structures at quantum scales where the rules governing larger assemblies no longer fully apply. Each technical claim, when examined rigorously, either reveals impossibilities according to established physics or requires extensions of theory into speculative territories where mathematics permits phenomena that observation has never confirmed, and determining which category specific claims fall into often proves impossible without physical evidence that can be subjected to measurement and testing. The correlation between nuclear weapons development and increased UFO sightings represents another thread that weaves through the larger narrative without ever quite proving causation. If non-human intelligence monitors human activity, our development of weapons capable of rendering this planet uninhabitable would represent a threshold worth observing, a species demonstrating both technological sophistication and potentially self-destructive tendencies, the combination marking us as either interesting subjects for study or emerging threats requiring attention. The proximity of Area 51 to the Nevada test site, where hundreds of nuclear devices were detonated, places the facility at the intersection of weapons development and alleged contact, though skeptics note that correlation alone proves nothing and that increased surveillance and security around nuclear facilities would naturally generate more opportunities for misidentification and false reports. The pattern exists in data, undeniable as statistical observation, but its meaning remains as contested as every other element in the larger mystery. What may prove most significant about Area 51 is not what it contains, but what it represents, a focal point for questions about transparency and authority, about who decides what knowledge populations can be trusted with and what must remain permanently withheld. Democratic societies rest on principles of informed citizenship, the idea that people should possess information necessary to make decisions about governance and policy, yet security requirements create exceptions to transparency that can grow to encompass virtually any information authorities deem too sensitive for public discourse. Area 51 embodies this tension perfectly, a facility whose existence was denied for decades despite obvious evidence, whose current operations remain classified despite the end of Cold War threats that originally justified such secrecy, a symbol of the power institutional structures possess to control narratives and limit knowledge regardless of public interest or democratic principles. Whether extraordinary secrets justify this control, or whether the control has become its own justification, self-perpetuating beyond any legitimate need, cannot be determined without access to what is being concealed, creating a circular logic from which escape requires either voluntary disclosure from within the system, or external revelation that overcomes classification barriers. The desert that holds these secrets, or holds only mundane military testing that speculation has transformed into mythology, continues its patient existence under stars that have witnessed the entirety of human history. Civilizations have risen and fallen, empires collapsed and reformed, while those distant suns burned steadily overhead, indifferent to terrestrial dramas of secrecy and speculation. Perhaps among those stars are worlds where similar questions have been asked and answered. Civilizations that have navigated the challenges of contact or achieved technological capabilities that make interstellar travel routine rather than theoretical. Perhaps we exist in isolation, the only conscious minds in this region of space, our questions about contact reflecting loneliness rather than any external reality. The lights in our skies all explicable through human activity and natural phenomena once sufficient information becomes available. The universe offers no clear signal either way, maintaining its own vast silence within which our smaller silences and secrets appear both profoundly important and cosmically insignificant. Human concerns that matter intensely to us while barely registering against the scale of space and time. The unanswered questions remain unanswered, residing in the gap between what is claimed and what is proven, between testimony and verification, between the possible and the demonstrated. They persist because secrecy prevents resolution, or because the truth is mundane and disappointing compared to the myths that have accumulated, or because reality proves more strange than either believers or skeptics have imagined. Falling into categories our current frameworks cannot quite accommodate, the questions endure, and in their endurance they serve purposes beyond simple curiosity, providing territory where wonder can survive in an age that increasingly offers explanations for everything, spaces where mystery maintains its grip despite humanity's best efforts to illuminate every corner and quantify every phenomenon into submission. Chapter 14. Outro. The stories settle around you now like dust after wind, particles of testimony and speculation, documented fact and unverified claim, each one catching what light remains before darkness completes its work. We have walked together through narratives that refuse simple resolution, through testimonies that carry conviction without offering proof, through landscapes where human secrecy and cosmic possibility intersect in ways that blur boundaries between the known world and territories that remain, perhaps deliberately, just beyond reach. The desert has served as witness to all of it. The mountains and salt flats and empty sky holding whatever truths exist without judgment or revelation, patient in ways that human urgency cannot match, indifferent to whether we ever bridge the distance between question and answer. What remains now is not conclusion but contemplation, the quiet space after investigation where certainty gives way to acceptance, that some mysteries persist not because we lack diligence in pursuing them, but because their nature or our position prevents the kind of knowing we seek. Area 51 endures as more than coordinates on maps or installations visible from satellite imagery. It has become a repository for human wandering, a place where the need to believe in something beyond ordinary experience can find purchase in soil that seems to offer, if not confirmation, then at least possibility that cannot be completely dismissed. The facility reflects back whatever we bring to it, our hopes for contact or our cynicism about governmental transparency, our faith in human ingenuity or our suspicion that we are not the only consciousness looking up at stars and asking whether the looking is reciprocated. In this way, it functions almost like a mirror, showing us not necessarily what exists in Nevada hangars, but what exists in our own minds. The questions we carry about significance and solitude, about whether the universe contains only matter following physical law, or whether awareness and intention emerge in forms we have not yet encountered, and might not recognize even when they present themselves. The people whose voices we have heard tonight, some famous and others anonymous, some credible and others contested, share a common thread beneath their differences in detail and interpretation. They have all stood at boundaries, either literally at the fence lines marking restricted territory, or figuratively at the edges of what their training and experience prepared them to understand, and they have all tried to communicate something of what they saw or learned or felt in those liminal spaces. Whether their accounts describe reality or misperception, genuine anomaly or classified but conventional technology, matters less in this moment than recognizing the sincerity with which most of them speak. The sense that something occurred that disrupted their previous certainties and left them carrying knowledge or questions that proved impossible to set down. We may never know which testimonies accurately describe hidden truths and which represent elaborate misunderstandings, but we can acknowledge that the experience of standing at such boundaries, of encountering the unexplained and being changed by the encounter, represents something real regardless of what external facts ultimately prove or disprove. The technologies we have explored tonight, from propulsion systems that manipulate gravity to materials that resist all attempts at conventional analysis, exist in a space between theoretical possibility and practical achievement that human science continues to navigate. Each generation pushes further into what physics permits, discovering that the universe allows phenomena stranger than previous understanding suggested, from quantum entanglement to the expansion of space itself at velocities exceeding light speed. Effects that would have seemed as impossible to earlier scientists as alien spacecraft seem to many contemporary researchers. The boundaries of the possible keep shifting as knowledge deepens, and what appears to violate natural law often simply indicates incomplete understanding of what those laws actually permit or require. Whether the specific claims made about Area 51 represent encounters with technology that pushes beyond current human capabilities or genuine contact with engineering from non-human sources, the conversation itself reveals how much room remains between what we have achieved and what physics might ultimately allow. Territories of possibility that remain unexplored, not because they are impossible, but because we have not yet discovered the paths that lead there. As sleep approaches and conscious thought begins its dissolution into dreams, the distinction between what is proven and what is possible softens. The mind in twilight between waking and sleeping moves more fluidly through categories that daylight consciousness keeps rigidly separated, allowing speculation and fact to coexist without demanding immediate resolution of their contradictions. Perhaps this liminal state offers its own kind of knowing, not the certainty that comes from evidence and verification, but the intuitive recognition that mystery serves purposes beyond simple absence of explanation, that not knowing can be generative rather than merely frustrating, opening spaces where imagination and curiosity remain active rather than foreclosed by premature conclusions. The secrets of Area 51, whatever they may be, participate in this larger category of unknowing, and in these quiet hours they need not be solved to be appreciated. Their presence in human consciousness valuable, not despite but because of their resistance to easy answers. The stars that have looked down on all these events, the testing and the speculation, the genuine innovations and the elaborate myths, continue their patient rotation overhead. They offer no commentary on human concerns, no validation of belief or skepticism, only their steady light travelling distances so vast that the photons reaching your eyes tonight began their journey long before any of these stories started to unfold, before Roswell or Groom Lake entered the vocabulary of mystery, when the questions we now ask had not yet formed in any human mind. That perspective, the cosmic scale against which our searching appears so brief and localized, provides its own form of comfort. Whether we are alone or observed, whether the technologies we pursue represent the limits of what consciousness can achieve, or merely early steps toward capabilities we cannot yet imagine, the universe continues its vast patient work of being, galaxies turning in their slow spirals, stars forming and dying, the elements of existence recombining in endless variation across space and time. Let the questions rest now. They will be there tomorrow if you wish to return to them, the testimonies and theories, the photographs and documents, all the accumulated fragments that point toward truths we have not yet assembled, or perhaps toward nothing more than the human capacity for pattern finding in random noise, meaning-making in the face of absence. For now, in this darkness, it is enough to have traced the contours of mystery without demanding it yield completely, to have explored the edges where certainty dissolves into speculation, and to recognize that some territories resist mapping, not because they are forbidden, but because their nature exists in states our current tools cannot quite capture. The desert wind moves through Joshua trees and over ridges, carrying no messages we can decode, making sounds that mean nothing beyond the physics of air moving across obstacles, or perhaps carrying information in frequencies we have not learned to detect. Signals we pass through without recognition, the universe speaking in languages we have not yet discovered, or that were never meant for us at all. Sleep comes now like distance, softening everything it touches, and in that softening the hard edges of unresolved mysteries become gentler, less urgent. Questions that can wait while consciousness releases its grip and drifts into the deeper darkness where even secrets cannot follow. The lights over Groom Lake will continue their patterns, whether anyone watches or not. The hangars will hold whatever they hold through the turning of the night, and the answers, if they exist, will remain where they have always been, patient as the desert, silent as the stars, waiting in that space between what we know and what we wonder, while you finally rest. Retry.